Welcome to part one of our organic weed management webinar series. This is the Understanding Weeds session. A little bit about CFSA, Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. We are a member-based nonprofit that helps people in North and South Carolina grow, eat, and enjoy local organic food, flowers, and fiber. And we do that through a combination of advocacy work, education, and building connections across the food systems. And I'll share some more slides about CFSA at the end of the presentation, but want to welcome you all to this webinar, whether you're a current CFSA member or not. My name is Sarah Runkle. I'm the local food program director with CFSA. I live in Western North Carolina. My background is as a small-scale diversified farmer. I worked on a number of farms and farmed myself for many years before getting into agricultural education. I ran a farmer training program in Pennsylvania for a few years and then worked for cooperative extension in Oregon for about 6 years before coming back to Western North Carolina. I joined CFSA in 2022 and excited to be doing this weed series with Joe. For the past few years, my focus has primarily been on food safety. We do a lot of food safety and market access work on the local food systems team, helping farmers with the harvest, post-harvest, and food safety compliance. But weeds and weed management, we recognize as a challenge for a lot of farmers. So I'm excited to do this series with Joe. And I'll let Joe introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Joe Rowland. I'm the Organic Initiatives Coordinator for CFSA, organic grower in the Charlotte metro area for about 12 years as an owner, operator, and then manager for a few other farms in the area. I came over to CFSA, I think in 2022 as well. I focus on organics, some conservation planning with NRCS, high tunnels as well. So thank y'all for being here. Happy to work with you on this stuff.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And Joe will be monitoring the chat and helping me by launching some polls. So we are expecting a lot of folks on this webinar, so we don't have time for folks to do individual introductions. But if you can tell us a little bit about yourself by completing this poll. And then if you want to put in the chat what your most problematic weeds are on your farm, if you know. And then if there are any particular crops that you found challenging when it comes to weed management. We also want to recognize that this event series is supported through the USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program, also referred to as TOPP. TOPP is a program of the USDA Organic Transition Initiative and is administered by the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service National Organic Program. Okay, it looks like most folks have completed the survey, and just so other folks can see, it looks like we've got a lot of beginning farmers, some home gardeners, a couple experienced farmers, and then lots of annual vegetables, fruits, and flowers. And it looks like everybody is either certified organic or farms using organic practices. In this particular webinar, we're going to talk about weed identification and weed biology and how different, weedy plant characteristics can inform your control strategies. And so in the next webinars, we will talk about prevention strategies. And then the third webinar, we'll talk about different control strategies. And then in the last webinar, we'll talk about developing integrated weed management plan, kind of putting it all together. Again, the goals for this webinar are pretty specific. We're going to talk about how to identify weeds and then understanding how plant growth and reproduction influence your weed management strategies. We have a little kind of pre-webinar survey to gauge folks' knowledge, and then we'll have a very similar survey at the end. All right, so let's just start out by talking about what is a weed. Kind of like a broad definition of what a weed is really just a plant out of place, right? So there are some weeds that have classification as, invasive and noxious weeds, but, when we think of a weed, it's a problematic plant, right? That's competing in an agricultural system with the crops that we're trying to grow. And so in the case of purslane, I love to use this example because some people consider purslane to be a weed, but then there are other folks who grow it as a crop and eat it, right? So purslane, I think, is typically considered a weed. It's a summer annual. It can certainly crowd out vegetable crops if you're not properly controlling it. It enjoys, an open habitat, rich, moist soil. So a lot of the same conditions that our, annual vegetables enjoy. It can produce a lot of seeds, and those seeds can remain viable in the soil for over 40 years. So it can be challenging to control sometimes because it is very low growing, right? It grows very close to the ground. But at the same time, it is edible. And you can see here in the bottom picture, some purslane for sale at farmers market. So it's really, your perspective on a particular plant. And here are a couple other examples, right? So dandelions, often considered a weed. We see them a lot this time of year. They're also kind of like the common dandelion. You can eat it. You can make dandelion wine. But there are also, cultivated varieties of dandelion that are grown and harvested as edible greens. The picture on the right is an example of a cover crop or a small grain crop that you may be intentionally growing, but if you let that buckwheat go to seed, it can become a weed in subsequent crops, right? So in this example, we've got a field of soybeans, which is the intended crop, and then a bunch of buckwheat that has reseeded itself and is coming up and is now a weed in that particular situation. We're concerned about weeds in a farming system because they compete with our crops, right? They take up resources like space, water, nutrients. Weeds can be hazardous. They can make harvest more difficult. They can negatively impact not only crop yields, but crop quality, right? So anybody who has a nut sedge problem and also grows potatoes may have seen how nut sedge can like penetrate into the potato tubers and damage the crop directly, in addition to competing for resources. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about control methods in this webinar. That's, the future webinars in this series, but do just want to highlight this concept of the critical weed-free period. And so in particular for annual crops, whether those are vegetables or flowers or herbs, grains, there is typically a critical weed-free period. In most vegetables, it's like 3 to 4 weeks from planting is the critical weed-free period. And that's when it's really essential to maintain that weed-free environment to prevent yield loss in the future. So we want to pay attention to that critical weed-free period when implementing our control strategies. we'll talk about weed growth and biology and its impact on different types of control strategies a little bit later in the webinar. But, for example, with carrots, right, that first, couple of weeks until the carrots really start to leaf out are critical for controlling weeds to protect yield. At the same time, we also want to think about that harvest window. So the harvest window is defined as the time from the end of that critical weed-free period until the crop is harvested. Typically, if we've done a decent job of controlling weeds, there isn't a whole lot to do during that harvest period related to weed management. However, if you do have a challenge with weeds, or if you let some weeds get away from you, there may be opportunities to implement control strategies during that harvest period, not only to reduce, impact on yield and ease of harvest, but also thinking about future weed problems, right, in subsequent seasons. So especially in organic systems, we really want to think about trying to prevent weeds, especially annual weeds that produce a lot of seed, from going to seed, even if they're not directly impacting the current crop, because that can lead to more problems the following season or in the following crop. So this whole series, we're focused on integrated weed management, which is very similar to, the concept of integrated pest management, which is typically discussed when talking about, pest and disease problems. The biologically based integrated pest management, also sometimes referred to as biointensive integrated pest management, really emphasizes preventative strategies that can be adopted when planning your cropping system. And the goal is to minimize opportunities for pests, in this case, weeds, to become a problem. And so when we talk about integrated weed management and IPM in general, right, we're really trying to employ a whole suite of strategies to control the pest, and utilizing the least toxic materials and the least ecologically disruptive tactics as much as possible. It should be noted that under the USDA National Organic Program, certified organic growers are required to take this approach to pest management, and then need to document both their preventative and control measures and the rationale, right? The why behind you have chosen and implemented the practices that you have. So today we're focusing on identification. The second webinar, we'll talk about prevention strategies. The third webinar is all of the different control strategies. And then the last webinar, we'll be talking about putting it all together into an integrated weed management plan and implementing evaluation and monitoring strategies. So the first step, when we're talking about identifying weeds, there are a number of questions that you should start asking yourself, right? So is this grass or sedge, or is this a broadleaf weed? The scientific classification, those are monocots, or those grasses and sedges, or dicots of broadleaf weeds. How does it reproduce? Is it sexual reproduction? Does it make a lot of seed? Or is it through vegetative reproduction, right? So does it spread through stolons or rhizomes, tubers? Does it do both? For plants that produce a lot of seed, how long do those seeds survive? And then also understanding whether or not it's an annual, a biennial, or a perennial. And we'll get into what those are in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. So that first step, right, is being able to tell whether it's a monocot. When it comes to weeds in agricultural systems, we're typically concerned with grasses, but there are some sedges like nut sedge that can be a problem. Rushes are also a type of monocot, but we typically don't see those in agricultural systems because they tend to grow in pretty wet environments. If I don't know if folks have heard this saying, but one way to tell the difference between the three is sedges have edges, so they have like triangular shaped seed stalks if you cut them in half. Rushes are round, so they have round stalks, and then grasses have knees that bend to the ground, and so grasses have like joints in their stems where sedges and rushes do not. Important to note with monocots that growing point is below the soil versus with dicots, which have two seed leaves. These are broadleaf weeds. Their growing point is above the soil. And so when we talk about flame weeding, this is something to keep in mind. Flame weeding tends to not be as effective with grasses because that growing point is below the soil surface. So they're somewhat insulated from the flame weeding. So early detection is key with weed control. Remember, we talked about that critical weed-free period, right? And so that's, early crop growth as well as early weed growth. And so being able to tell the difference between your weeds and your crops, especially when you're direct seeding, is really critical. So here's some common weeds. Does anybody know what these are? You can put it in the chat. We've got on the left here is red root pigweed. And that picture in the middle is the mature version. So one mature pigweed plant can produce up to 400,000 seeds, and that seed can remain viable in the soil for 10 to 40 years. The one on the right is lamb's quarters, a summer annual, and it's not quite as prolific as pigweed, but can still produce 70,000 to 100,000 seeds, and those seeds can remain viable in the soil for more than 20 years. Here's another quiz. Anybody know what these two are? The one on the left is hairy galansoga. This is a very common summer annual in the Carolinas. And the one on the right is chickweed, which you're likely seeing right now. This is the time of year for chickweed to flower and go to seed. Galansoga can produce up to 7,500 seeds per plant, but the seeds have very little dormancy, and they only last a few years in the soil. Chickweed seed, chickweeds can produce 2,500 to 30,000 seeds per plant, and they can remain viable in the soil for over 10 years. And chickweeds can produce multiple generations of plant in 1 year. So they can flower within a month and set seed in 2 to 3 months. And so you can quickly have a big chickweed problem if it's competing with your crops if you don't control it. And Pam, we'll talk about some resources for weed ID in a couple slides. All right, moving on to some monocots. Does anyone know what either of these are? Close. All right, so on the left, we've got large crabgrass, sometimes referred to as hairy crabgrass. And the right, we have quackgrass. So crabgrass is an annual, it's a summer annual, very prolific seed producer. So upwards of 150,000 seeds in a single growing season for one plant. Part of the problem with crabgrass, it's a prolific seeder, but it also creates lots of tillers, which is the grass version of branches. So one plant can create up to 700 tillers. So they can get very, very big, and those tillers can all send up seed stalks. And then they are also pretty resistant to mowing because they can produce seed even at heights as low as 1/2 inch. So they can spread low on the ground and put out seed. Quackgrass, which is the plant on the right, is a perennial. So they don't produce a lot of seed. 25 to 40 seeds per stem. A single plant can produce up to 400 seeds in ideal conditions, which you might be like, oh, that's good. It's not so bad compared to crabgrass. But if anybody has a quackgrass problem, you know that baby quackgrass is not the issue, right? So quackgrass primarily spreads through very extensive underground rhizomes. And they can produce a system of rhizomes extending 11 feet in diameter, which equates to over 440 feet of rhizomes from one plant. And when you cut those up, every rhizome piece that has not a node on it can produce a new plant. And so that vegetative reproduction capacity of quackgrass is why it really can become so problematic and is difficult to control. And last but not least, who knows what this one is? This is yellow nutsedge. Nutsedge can produce a lot of seeds in a single season, up to 90,000 seeds. However, that seed viability is very low, and the seeds often fail to germinate. The real reason why nutsedge is a problem is because of its extensive underground network of rhizomes and then these little tubers that it produces. And so it can produce rhizomes extending out 6.5 feet in all directions. And those rhizomes produce tubers at their tips, which are these little nut-like mature tubers. And a single plant can make up to 7,000 tubers in a year. And every single nutsedge tuber can grow and make 1,900 shoots. It is a very difficult weed to control. So we will talk about strategies in future presentations, but recognize that this biology of the plant is why it is so problematic. There's also a note here on the slide. You can see not only do they make a lot of tubers, but they can remain dormant in the soil for over a decade. All right. So there are a lot of weeds that look similar, and these are some weeds that you may be seeing in your field or your high tunnel, your gardens this time of year. They all look pretty similar. Would you all agree with that? Does anybody know what these are? Yes, henbit. Yes, so one of these is henbit. So the one in the middle is henbit. The two on the left are both Lamian species. These are all in the mint family. The two on the left, so purple dead nettle and henbit, look very similar. They are both annual weeds that reproduce by seed. Purple dead nettle produces a lot more seed than henbit. And then the one on the right is ground ivy, which is a creeping perennial. It's also referred to as creeping Charlie. So understanding whether something is an annual versus a perennial, how it reproduces, these all contribute to your choice of control strategies in the future. So how would you know if you had one of these three growing in your field? Like, how would you go about figuring out whether or not it's purple dead nettle or henbit or ground ivy? This is where our weed identification resources come into play. So there are a lot of great resources available. This Weeds of the South book is a really helpful resource that has great index to help you identify weeds, right, based on various characteristics, right? So there's plant growth habit, there's the bloom type, leaf shape, stem shape. Weeds of the South focuses on, the weeds that we see in the Southeast. There are two websites in the Southeast that I've found pretty helpful. So Clemson has a good weed identification website, which includes a lot of great images and descriptions of like how different leaf shapes are described, all the different like characteristics that any sort of key for weed identification is going to ask you about. They also just have a lot of good pictures of the most common weeds in the Southeast. The Virginia Tech Weed ID website is also very helpful. You can search by common name or Latin name, and then it also breaks out by the broadleaf and dicots. And then they do have like an other category. And then we do have a lot of overlap with the weeds of the Northeast. And so that's also a good resource. Someone had a question about a weed ID app. There are some apps you can download. I know some folks use like iNaturalist as a tool to help identify weeds, where you can, point your camera, take a picture, and the app will help identify the weed. But just know that they're not 100% accurate. So you always want to verify what the app tells you with what you're actually seeing in the field. All right. So I've already mentioned these different life cycles, but let's just talk about them in a little bit more detail. So understanding whether a weed is an annual, a biennial, or a perennial is really important because they reproduce in different ways and can be more or less difficult to control. So an annual is a plant that completes their life cycle in less than 1 calendar year. Biennials take up to 2 years to complete their life cycle, and then perennials live for more than 2 years. When it comes to annuals, they really are a year-round problem. So we see they're kind of classified into two main categories. We've got cool season or winter annuals that you tend to see flowering this time of year, and then summer annuals. They reproduce primarily by seed. We already talked about some of those examples, and most annuals produce a lot of seed. They have also evolved with adaptations that help with weed seed dispersal, right? So they might have barbs on the seed where they can kind of hitchhike on your clothes or on animal fur, hairs that can latch onto things or allow them to blow in the wind more easily. Some have like explosive seed dispersal mechanisms. If you've ever pinched a jewelweed pod, that's an example of that explosive dispersal where the seed pod pops open and the seed goes everywhere. So winter annuals, typically we see them germinate in the fall, and they are cold tolerant. So they often they put on some vegetative growth in the fall, and they kind of maintain their existence over the winter. They can tolerate those cooler temperatures and low light levels. And then as things start to warm up in the spring, this is the time when they start to flower and go to seed. They typically die off as weather gets hot. So henbit's a good example of this. It will typically, the plant, if it gets too hot, the plant just dies off. Summer annuals, on the other hand, are germinate when the soil temperatures start to warm up. So in the spring or early summer, and they can go to seed through the summer into the fall. They are very quick to germinate and can quickly outcompete a lot of flowers and vegetables. Some of them have multiple generations each year, and so some have very short life cycles, and can set seed. Those seeds can germinate and produce a whole nother crop, all in 1 year. So some common summer annuals include galansoga, purslane, pigweed, crabgrass. The pictures on the bottom, there are a couple others in here. Burr cucumber, which is a vine, is a summer annual. And then the second picture from the right is common ragweed. Produces a lot of seed and also produces a lot of pollen. All right. Biennials can germinate at any time during the growing season. Typically, they take 2 seasons to complete their life cycle. So in the first season, you'll just see growth as this, what's referred to as a rosette stage. So this vegetative growth. They'll create a radial cluster of flowers and the leaves like close to the ground in the first season. And then in the second season, they send up a flower stalk, also referred to as bolting, and they use that food stored in the root system from the previous year to put on that reproductive growth. They set seed and then they die. So it's easier to control them in the first year by removing the rosettes. Some common examples of biennials are Queen Anne's lace, which are the pictures in the slide, but also mullein, common burdock. Bull thistle is a biennial thistle species. And then the last category we'll talk about are perennials. So perennials live at least 2 years. Some perennials can live for decades. Most reproduce by both seed and by their vegetative parts. So whether it's tubers or stolons, rhizomes, bulbs. So this combination of reproductive mechanisms can make their management really difficult. And so properly identifying your perennials weed problems and how they reproduce and spread will help you develop a more successful weed management strategy. This is a picture of Canada thistle. When we talk about perennials, they're often divided into 2 categories. Simple perennials like dandelions that have a taproot. They just spread by seed and they don't spread vegetatively. Sometimes, however, vegetative structures, if you leave them in the ground, they can produce new plants. So yellow dock, the dandelion, right? If you don't get the whole thing out, sometimes it can grow back. But they resprout year after year from their crown buds that are formed on a taproot. Versus creeping perennials, which can be really problematic, especially in perennial systems, or if you're moving from a perennial system, say like a very weedy hayfield that has a lot of creeping perennials, and wanting to put that into annual vegetable production. Be prepared if you have creeping perennials to spend some time on good weed management before you plant any of those annual crops. They have creeping roots and stems, also called rhizomes and stolons. They can reproduce both by seed and vegetatively. These really are like the hardest kind of group of weeds to get rid of, and you often need to implement multiple control strategies over time. Knowing how weeds reproduce is a key part of your integrated weed management plan and will allow you to choose appropriate preventative and control strategies to manage those weeds throughout the year. So now we're going to move on to talking about signs of reproductive growth. So knowing the signs of reproductive growth, especially for seed production in grasses and broadleaf weeds, is very helpful because in an organic system, preventing weeds from going to seed is a key control strategy for managing weeds in future crops. In perennials and biennials, wheat plants can be weaker when going to seed, and so sometimes mowing or physical removal can be more effective at this stage. So both dicots, grasses, and broadleaf plants have key, growth formations when they're going to seed. With monocots or grasses, this is referred to as the boot stage. And so the grasses will send up a flag leaf, which is an early leaf for that seed producing stalk. In broadleaf weeds or plants, they will send up a seed stalk, which is referred to as bolting. Before both dicots and monocots or broadleaf and grasses go to seed, they will go through this pre-bloom stage. Especially with grasses, they will shed a lot of pollen. Bloom, you'll see the flower or pollen expression, and then they produce seed. So you can see here some images of the grass stages, and then a thistle in flower. A couple slides back, we had that, thistle in seed. You can see they've got all these little hairs on the seeds, which allow them to blow around in the wind very effectively. All right, so we've talked a lot about how weeds reproduce, but it's not the only biological factor to consider when controlling or when choosing control strategies. So some other things to think about, and I'd encourage you to read. There's a really great resource. Joe will send a link, put a link in the chat, and we'll send it in a follow-up email to folks. But this got Managing Weeds on Your Farm, a guide to ecological strategies. There's a chapter called How to Think About Weeds that has a lot of really great detailed information about how all of these different kind of biological factors of weeds influence their growth and the type of control strategy you may or may not choose. So the size of weed seed, right? So a lot of annual weeds produce very small seeds. They can produce a lot of them. This means, like sometimes weed seed will end up in your cover crop seed, right? Because they are so small, they kind of pass through the screening. They also, germinate very close to the soil surface. What triggers germination, whether they go through a dormancy period or not, how long they live in the soil. So we've talked about, some seeds like mullein, for example, can be viable for over 100 years. Dead nettle, there's a study that found that seed was viable over 600 years later. Their relative growth rate we'll talk about in a couple of slides, but a lot of weeds have adapted to be very good at putting on a lot of quick early growth compared to our crops that we're trying to grow. And so they can quickly outcompete our crops that we're trying to grow. They're also, because of that quick, vigorous growth, can uptake nutrients and store nutrients very well, and keep your crops from being able to access those nutrients. We talked about seed production and then also dispersal methods as well. So some seeds can be shot up to 20 feet away. And knowing how those weeds can move around and the weeds that you have is critical. The weed seed bank, has anybody heard this term before? So I like to joke that it's the one bank where you don't want to be saving anything. Weed seeds can, as we said, remain viable in the soil for a very long time. I need to go back one slide. I've got a note about, sorry, I've got the wrong cursor. So a Canadian study found that between 200 and 12,000 weed seeds could be present in the top inch of a 1 square meter area. Given how many seeds certain weeds produce and how long they can be remain viable in the soil, letting weeds go to seed, especially at the end of the season, even if they're not impacting the current crop, can quickly become a problem for future crops. And a lot of seeds have the ability to remain dormant in the soil. And so, if you're plowing or doing any deep tillage, that can move those seeds lower in the soil profile. And then if you till again, it can bring those dormant seeds up to the surface. It is important to note, and we'll talk about this in the sanitation prevention webinar, but there are some strategies you can implement to help increase the chances of predation of weed seeds in the soil, especially by beetles. And there are methods like a stale seedbed technique that you can implement to kind of do a quick flush and then not do any tillage to disturb the soil so that you're not bringing any more of those weed seeds up to the surface. So this table on the right here, you can see it can take many years for, a significant reduction in the weed seed bank over time, right? So for lamb's quarter, right, a 50% reduction can take 12 years and a 99% reduction of seed can take 78 years. Versus something like foxtail, where it has very short viability, right? So we get almost 100% reduction after 5 years. Weeds are really very opportunistic. There are a lot of weeds that have evolved with this competitive advantage that is particularly suitable or adapted to disturbed soil, which is something that we create all the time in agriculture, especially in our annual cropping systems. So, a lot of these weed species, their seeds can be triggered to germinate in response to tillage and that bare ground. So exposure to sunlight, the warmer soil temperatures that you see in bare ground. Often they're triggered by that temperature fluctuation in the spring and early summer between warm days and cool nights. And then some weeds have even developed a strategy of being triggered to germinate when there's like a higher concentration of nitrate in the soil. And so when you do that kind of like early kind of boost of nitrogen application when you're planting a crop, that also provides a competitive advantage to your weeds as well. Many weeds have a dormancy cycle, and it really just depends on the species. And so some don't have any dormancy cycle, so they can, grow and set seed, and then those seeds are ready to germinate right away. Whereas other ones will set seed in the fall, and then they need a cold period in order to be triggered to germinate the following year. So getting to know your particular weeds, especially the really problematic ones, can be very helpful. We already talked about this. I don't need to like overemphasize how many seeds these different weeds can produce, but you might think, oh, it's just a couple weeds out there, but next year you might not be saying the same thing. A couple more, points about how long different weed seeds can remain viable in the soil. Again, some don't last for very long, like quackgrass. So if you have a quackgrass problem, you've got more than seeds are your problem, right? Like those seeds don't last very long, but they reproduce primarily vegetatively. Let's see, wild carrot, those seeds don't last very long. That's a biennial. So ideally, you could get that in control pretty easily by keeping it from going to seed and cultivating or managing that wild carrot in its first year of growth. Other things like field bindweed, the seed remains viable for a very long time. It has a very hard coat, and it is a larger size seed, so it can germinate from kind of a lower soil profile than some of our very small seeded weeds like lamb's quarters. And so if you know you have this issue, think about, as we talk about control strategies in the next couple of webinars, that the life cycle of those weeds and how that plays into the different control strategies you choose. I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about weed dispersal. I already mentioned how a lot of different plants have evolved different strategies for dispersal, whether it's like burrs or hairs or that, explosive seed dispersal, the referred to as forceful dehiscence. But it's also important to recognize that seeds can be moved by us, right? So, and by our animals. So it can be moved on equipment. If you're moving equipment around from field to field, this is true both with seeds and with vegetative reproductive or growth structures like rhizomes and stolons, root pieces. Getting quackgrass wound up on your tiller and then not cleaning it off and going to another field. Now you might be introducing quackgrass into a new area. The same with seeds. So good equipment, sanitation is really important. Also thinking through like crop seed sourcing and cover crop seed sourcing. You can bring in weed seeds. That way you can bring in weed seeds through hay or straw. There's some weeds that the seeds survive the digestive tract of animals. So if you're applying manure or manure that hasn't been adequately composted to a temperature that would kill those weed seeds, that's another way to introduce them to your farm. And then with an asexual reproduction, it's really that like sanitation of equipment is really key. So those, all those little bits and pieces, if you move them around your farm, you're just spreading that problem across the farm. And so in this image on the right, you can see, right, like different types of dispersal. You can move, maybe just a foot with rain splash, or ants can move weed seeds around, maybe 100 feet. But, when we're talking about contaminated seed, you can move weeds across the country if you've got contaminated cover crop seed coming in, or, equipment can move weeds across very long distances. And livestock as well can move weeds around on your farm, but also if you have livestock coming in from other farms. So both in their manure, but maybe in their bedding or in their feet, right? There's lots of different ways to move weeds around. I mentioned the fact that nitrate levels in the soil can help trigger germination in some weed species, but it's also important to recognize that a lot of weeds can, grow very quickly and quickly uptake and store nutrients, which is in competition to your crops that you're trying to grow. They grow relatively quickly compared to crop seedlings. And so one strategy that you can implement is to choose a slow release nutrient source, especially a slow release nitrogen source, rather than providing like a large boost of nitrogen at planting time. So your crop plants aren't going to be able to take up all that nitrogen at the beginning of the season. They're going to need it over time as they grow. And so matching your nutrient source dispersal with your crop plant growth can also help with weed management. So there are other reasons why you want to do that, but weed management is one of the reasons why you should consider implementing that strategy. Early weed identification is really critical for anything that you're trying to control mechanically or even with a flame weeder. Ideally, with mechanical cultivation, you are controlling weeds at the white thread stage. And we'll talk about this more in the third webinar, but let me see if I can get this laser to work. Let's see. I don't know if folks can see here. You guys seeing that? So you can barely even see them. The background they chose for this picture is not great, but above the penny here, you can see these are weed seeds that have just started to germinate. They don't even have their cotyledons haven't even come up. Whoops. On the right here, you can see they're just starting with their first seed leaves coming out. Oops, sorry. And so this white thread stage right here, you can see it barely even has its seed leaves, but it already has this like beginning of root growth here on the right. And then on the, oh sorry, the pictures on the left, you can see like these weeds have their cotyledons, their first seed leaves are fully emerged and they're just starting to get their first true leaves. And this is often when we in the field see weeds for the first time, right? Because they're green, you can actually see them. But look how much larger the roots are that have developed on those plants on the left versus the ones on the right. So that white thread stage is the time when you want to be cultivating the weeds because it's much easier to disrupt those weeds, the ones on the right at that growth stage, than it is the plants on the left that already have those pretty well established roots, even though the green growth at the top looks pretty small. So one saying I've heard folks say is like, if you can see the weeds from the tractor seat and you're cultivating, it's already too late. So getting out there and disturbing the soil, seeing what's germinating early is really important. So you're going to get much better control on those weeds with cultivation, the smaller the weeds are. We've already talked about this slide a little bit, but Who remembers the difference between, does anybody remember anything I said about these three weeds from the beginning? What do purple dead nettle and henbit have in common? Yeah. So dead nettle and henbit are both annuals versus ground ivy, sometimes also called creeping Charlie, is a perennial. And why would knowing that make a difference? They're all flowering in my garden right now. I have them all. They're all there. Would you leave any of these? Would you leave all of them? Does anybody have these? Typically, they're not like a huge problem, but yeah, chickens like to eat them. So you could pull them out and feed them to your chickens, or if you don't have any, leafy greens growing in your garden, you could let the chickens in to eat them. Dead nettle, purple dead nettle can produce up to 27,000 seeds a year, and those seeds can remain viable for a very long time. Some have been found viable after 600 years, right? So sometimes these become a problem in high tunnels. If you're doing like winter vegetable production, they can interfere with, compete for nutrients. But they also provide good, forage for pollinators early in the season when a lot of other stuff isn't flowering. Henbit, the one in the middle, also produces a lot of seed, but not nearly as much as dead nettle. So 200 to 2,000 seeds a year. Those seeds can remain viable for a long time too, 25 to 40 years. But they're not very competitive. So they're going to die out with higher temperatures. And so maybe you can just leave it as a ground cover and under your peppers or tomatoes or, a summer crop where eventually that's going to die out. Ground ivy is a perennial weed. So you might not see this in like a typical annual vegetable cropping system, but because it is a perennial and it can reproduce through its stolons and rhizomes, it can quickly form dense clumps. And those vegetative pieces will create more plants. And so, if you do have ground ivy, right, like tilling that in is not going to help you very much. You're just going to make more of a problem. Or if you're weeding and you're not actually removing all of the roots, those plants are going to come back and continue to be a problem. It is very low growing, but because it's a perennial, it will survive year after year. Once it gets established, right, it can be competitive with other crops that you're trying to grow by taking up water and nutrients. It stays relatively low to the ground, so it might not compete for sunlight with other more established crops. But it also has a pretty fibrous root system, so it could make, cultivation or weed management around other plants a challenge. Some next steps, and we will have time for Q&A here in a little bit, but hopefully you all recognize the importance of identifying your weeds and that this is really a year-round process. So right now, go out in your farm and see what weeds you have. Can you identify those weeds? Go to those resources I shared, the Clemson website, the Virginia Tech, Weeds of the South are all good resources. And then keep checking throughout the year and make notes. And I find it very helpful to have a map of your farm. Hopefully you have a map already, but you could create a separate kind of like weed map for your farm where you identify certain hotspots for different types of weeds. If they're like, if you do have a patch of quackgrass or nutsedge, or that you had a bunch of pigweed go to seed last year, Maybe that's not the best place to plant carrots this coming year, right? So thinking about how weeds impact crop rotation choices. We'll talk about that in the second webinar. Really try to figure out what weeds are most problematic for your farm, right? And so, what impact are those weeds having on the crops that you want to grow? Making sure you know what they are, how they reproduce, really understanding why they're a problem, right? Are they reducing yields for your crops that you're trying to grow? Do they interfere with harvest? Competing with your crops for resources, and spend some time learning about their biology. So those resources I shared have some good information. There are lots of weed identification and biology resources out there. If you can't find what you're looking for on the resources that have been shared, I would say, like, if you're going to do a Google search, you can put in the common name, or if you know the Latin name, and then end the search with .edu, and that'll pull up extension resources that are, I find, more accurate sometimes than the broad depths of the internet. So finding extension resources using that .edu at the end of your search can be very helpful.